everyone. My name is Francesca Wadley, and I did my presentation on deaf queer coition. So what is deaf queer coition? It is the intersectionality of deaf queer culture in terms of sex, sexuality, and bodily pleasure. Additionally, it is the intersectionality of deaf queer as well as deaf space. So what I found that there are limited resources for deaf queers outside of campus. There are deaf spaces and resources for those who are deaf. There are queer spaces and resources for queers with mental illness. For example, there is the Trans Lounge, which is basically like a group therapy, virtual, of course, through Zoom, for those that are in toxic environments and are unable to get access to mental health. The first article I found on deaf queer coition was not here in the US. Instead, it was in the Philippines, where HIV is considered a pandemic, and there are little to no resources for deaf education, deaf queer education, sexual education, and or sexual health. There are bills that are being passed and government programs that are being set in place in order to reach out to the deaf community, queer community, and deaf queer community to provide sexual education as well as sexual health to prevent the spread of HIV and AIDS. The next article I found took more of a political approach towards deaf culture and deaf queer culture. It explored the question of how come young people are not getting involved in traditional politics. Well, the simple answer is because traditional politics are not made for young people. Instead, young people are getting involved in politics by either joining clubs that have both political influences as well as opportunities to get involved in politics. A lot of deaf queers have joined these clubs in order to create deaf queer spaces, such as the 340 Club and Pomona, which hosts deaf queer nights occasionally. I found this third article to be very interesting. It was an in-depth discussion regarding deaf queer sexual inclusiveness to sexuality, as well as better access for deaf persons and deaf queer for sexual health. These sexual conferences are a safe space in order to explore coition within the deaf community, as well as sexuality without the prejudice of social conventions. And I did learn a lot of what is deaf space, what it is, what it represents in class, as well as doing these projects. Where I found deaf space is a physical space, could be a bar, a diner, a movie theater, a club, which is considered a safe space for deaf culture to thrive. discussion topics such as sharing information, forming relationships, sharing perspective on similar experiences, etc. Lastly, as well as intersectionality. When one identifies with more than one cultural identity, those cultural identities can come into conflict. For example, both deaf culture and Hispanic culture both believe in family first. However, deaf culture states that deaf is first and those that are deaf are considered family. Meanwhile, and the Hispanic culture dictates that immediate family comes first above all other priorities. So if one is born deaf and Hispanic, it can be difficult to manage the intersectionality of those identities, because which would you prioritize? The deaf culture above the culture that you grew up with? It can be very difficult. But with a healthy environment, it can be manageable. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.